Hey friends, welcome back to the 𝘶𝗶𝗋 podcast. At the time of this recording, it's almost mid-April, and you may be thinking, oh my gosh, it's almost the end of the year and my kids still can't write. What am I going to do? Well, first off, if you're thinking that, just know that you are not the only one. I can't tell you how many years I had like that. So that's what today's podcast is about. It's about helping you figure out ways to get those struggling kids to a place where you feel comfortable sending them on to the next grade level with their writing abilities. So let's get started. So it's mid-April right now when I'm recording this podcast, and your kids should really be at a certain point at this time of the year in their writing. Hopefully, you've introduced all the different genres of writing to them. They should have been introduced to how-to writing, narrative writing, informational writing, and opinion writing. And they may be doing better in some of those areas than in others, depending upon how much time you spent on each of those genres. But you want to send them on to the next grade level feeling confident in their writing because you know there's the summer slump. No matter what anybody says, it happens and they're going to forget. But you want to have them have a really strong foundation so that when they do come back in the fall, they pick things up quickly. Because honestly, writing is probably one of the last things that parents are going to practice with their kids during the summer. They might go to the library and get some books for them to read. They may sit and read to their kids or have their kids read to them, and they might even practice their math facts. But it's pretty uncommon for parents to do a whole lot of practice with writing. At least that's what I experienced when I was teaching. So how can you get your kids to a place where they feel really confident in their writing when they leave you and when they're ready to move on to the next grade level? I do think that there's a few different things that you can do to help them improve their writing. So today, I'm just going to give you a few tips that may help you out. All right, so tip number one is you should be having them write every single day. I know that writing tends to take a little longer than some other things, but it's really important that they are practicing their writing. And it doesn't always have to be a formal writing lesson, although I almost feel like that should be happening every day too. But if you don't have time for that, you can fit writing into their day in several different ways. For one, you can give them a journal that they can write in every day when they first come into the classroom. You can put a simple writing prompt on the board and have kids write about that in their journal. And then before you begin the day, take a quick walk around the room and glance at their writing. You don't have to grade their journals every day, but take a quick look. And if you notice a student who's really struggling that day in their writing, have them put their journal on your desk as a reminder. And then later on, sometime when you have, an extra minute or two, pull that kid up to your desk and just kind of review whatever the issue is in their writing that day. It only takes a few minutes, but sometimes that's all it takes to help your struggling writers. Another way you can have kids write every single day is at your writing center. You can have all kinds of different templates for how-to writing, opinion writing. You can have greeting cards, you can have postcards, you can have letter writing templates. All those kinds of things can be at your writing center so that when kids go there, they have an opportunity to practice some of the different genres. So having kids do a little bit of writing every single day in the classroom, I think is really important at this point in the year. And it doesn't have to be, a 30-minute lesson every single day. It can just simply be practice because, practice makes perfect. All right. Tip number 2 is to use word walls. I think it's good to have word walls around your classroom. And I'm not talking about your standard sight word wall. I'm talking about word walls that would give kids ideas for what to write about. So for instance, I'm doing this podcast right now in April. So some of the kinds of word walls that you could have in your classroom in April would relate to some of the things that are happening in spring. Maybe you have an insect word wall, or maybe you have a word wall that would go with gardening or planting flowers or something like that. You could have an Easter word wall. So having different word walls that go along with the season or the holidays or that type of thing in your classroom can be really helpful to kids when they're thinking about what they want to write about. And maybe they're struggling with how to write certain words that aren't sight words or they're not phonetically spelled words, but they might want to include them in their writing and they get tripped up with those words and it just causes them to kind of shut down. So when you have a word wall up for them to look at, that's really helpful to them. They can be big word walls that you hang in the classroom, or they could be little mini word walls that they can keep at their desks or in their seat sack. I used to have my kids sit at tables of 4 at each table. And so I had a binder where I'd put all the mini word walls. I would just put them in plastic sleeve protectors. And then whenever I added new word walls to those binders, I'd tell the kids, this month we're going to add an Easter word wall or an insect word wall or a spring word wall or whatever month it was. And I'd put those in. And then every table had their own binder. So when kids were working on their writing, they could grab that binder off the shelf and have it at the table. And then if they needed help with the word, they could just look in the binder at the little mini word wall. And so I think that having some kind of word walls in your classroom can be really, really helpful to kids. When I taught kindergarten, we made a new word wall every single month together in shared writing. It would usually go with, a holiday that month, or it would go with a season or something like that. So like maybe in the fall, we'd make a word wall and it would have words like leaves and pumpkin and scarecrow and acorn, words like that. And then the kids would actually help me write those words on sentence strips, and then we'd cut them up and I'd put them on the word wall with a little picture next to it so that the kids knew how to spell those words. And they were much more invested in it, and they remembered those words were there because they helped me make it. And then once we made that big word wall, then I'd make it into a small word wall too, and then I'd put those in the binders. So those types of things are great ways to help your struggling writers. Okay, tip number 3 is to make some anchor charts of each genre of writing. So for instance, make an anchor chart that shows opinion writing. Show that it has to start with their opinion, it has to have 2 or 3 reasons why, and then show how they have to close their writing by stating their opinion again. And actually have an example of that with arrows pointing to, this is the opening, these are the 3 reasons, this is the closing, so that it helps them remember that they have to include those things when they're doing their own opinion writing or informational writing or narrative writing or whatever it is. So create an anchor chart for each genre of writing and keep those in the same place all the time so the kids know exactly where to look. Don't move them around and put them in different places, because then kids don't know where they are and then they won't use them. So just leave them in the same place, and then they know that's where I look if I'm going to do opinion writing, or that's where I look when I'm going to do information writing. So they know exactly where to look. Anchor charts can really help them remember the kinds of things that they need to include in their writing. I'm a big believer in anchor charts. I use them all the time, and the kids really did use them. One of the reasons that the kids used them, though, was because we made them together. So anytime you can make those charts and word walls, anything like that with your kids, they're going to be way more invested and probably use them more than if it was just some store-bought poster that you bought at, a teaching store. All right, tip number 4 is to talk to your kids about what good writing looks like. I think we don't do that often enough with kids. We just kind of sometimes make the assumption that they know what good writing should look like. So every single time you're doing a writing lesson, talk to them about what you're doing when you're demonstrating writing. Talk to them about how, I'm putting a capital letter at the start of my sentence, or see how I'm putting spaces between each of my words, or notice how I'm putting a period at the end of my sentence. Talk to them about how you're forming your letters correctly, that your writing is neat, it's not sloppy, people can read it. So every time you do a writing lesson, regardless of whether you think you're repeating yourself and the kids have already heard this from you a million times, there's some kid in the back of the class that doesn't remember. And that's why they're struggling. So it doesn't have to take you a really long time to say all those things, but just as you're demonstrating how to do, procedural writing or informational writing, talk through what makes this good writing, because they hear you when you're doing that. And then they're going to be more apt to include those things when they're doing their own writing. All right, tip number 5, if you've got kids that are struggling, is to give them some writing prompts. Not every kid needs a writing prompt at this time of the year, but if you have kids that are struggling, part of the problem may be that they simply don't know what to write about. So those word walls are going to help with that, but you can also just give them some simple writing prompts that they could pick from, and not necessarily just one prompt. Maybe on the board you want to write 3 different writing prompts and let them choose the one that kind of resonates with them the best, something that they know about. I think that writing prompts can really help your struggling writers, because half the time that's the biggest problem, is that they seriously just don't know what to write about. So help them out, give them some suggestions that'll kind of spark their imagination and get them going. Another thing that I found really helpful when I had kids who were struggling was that part of the problem was that they had that first sentence in their mind, but then they didn't know where to go next. So sometimes when I'd be walking around and I'd be watching the kids do their writing independently, I'd see one kid sitting there and they'd have one sentence on their page and then they'd be like, I'm done. And so I'd read that sentence out loud to them and then I'd say, what happened next? Like, for instance, if the kid wrote, I was riding my bike, and then they're done, they don't know what else to say. I'd say, what happened next after you were riding your bike? And then maybe they'd say, I went to the park. And so I'd say, good, write that down. And then they'd write, I went to the park. And then, they think they're done again. And then I'd come back and I'd be like, well, what happened when you got to the park? Did you play on any toys? What'd you do? And they'd say stuff like, I went down the slide. And then I'd say, write that down. Now you have a story. So sometimes saying that little question of what happened next really helped my kids continue their writing so they didn't get stuck on just one sentence. And then tip number 6, if you have kids who are struggling with their writing or just simply not exactly where you'd like them to be in their writing at this point in the year, is to use templates. I had a bunch of templates that I used for different genres of writing, especially things like informational writing or opinion writing or letter writing. Because when kids are doing like narrative writing, there isn't any specific things they have to have in their writing. But when they're doing something like opinion or informational writing or letter writing, there are specific things that are supposed to be included in those types of writing. And kids sometimes forget those when they're doing it. So for example, with letter writing, they have to start off with a greeting, and then they have to have the body of the letter. Then they have to have a closing, and then they have to have the signature, right? So they don't always remember that they have to have all those things in a letter. So when you have a template that has lines for those things and even words that say greeting, body, closing, signature, it helps kids remember what they're supposed to do in those different genres. So I had templates that were differentiated. The ones I used with my struggling writers had more direction on them than for my kids who were on level or advanced. Usually my advanced writers didn't even need a template, but those kids who are struggling, they might need a template that could really help them out and get them to a better place in their writing before the end of the year. So those are just a few tips that you can do to help your kids if they're still struggling with their writing or just not quite where you want them to be. So just to recap, have kids write every day, use word walls and anchor charts, talk to kids about what good writing looks like, and give them writing prompts to help spark their imagination when writing. And then finally, use differentiated writing templates to help guide their writing. If you'd like to see the writing templates and word walls that I use, I'll put the link in the show notes and you can take a closer look at them there. All right, friends, that's it for today. Hang in there. You're on the downward slide now, and the end of the year is near. Until next time, remember to make learning feel like play, and I'll talk to you soon.